It is the 22nd of October 2023, and the United States Grand Prix at Circuit of the Americas has just finished. Max Verstappen has won. It is his 16th victory of the season. There are 6 races remaining. The Constructors' Championship has already been settled. The Drivers' Championship was settled 5 races ago. In the paddock, the engineers from Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, and McLaren are doing what they have been doing all year, studying the Red Bull data package, the onboard footage, the sector time breakdowns, and reaching the same conclusion they have been reaching since the first race of the season in Bahrain in March. They can see what the car is doing. They cannot see why it is doing it. The lap time advantage the RB19 carries at every circuit it visits is not concentrated in any single sector. It is distributed, fast in the high-speed corners, fast in the medium-speed corners, fast in the slow corners, fast under braking, fast on traction, fast in a straight line. A car that is faster everywhere is not a car with a single innovation that rivals can study, copy, and deploy. It is a car whose total system has reached a level of integration that cannot be replicated by addressing any individual component. By the time you understand what Adrian Newey and the Red Bull technical team had built across the preceding 3 seasons and what the RB19 represented as the terminal expression of that work, you will understand why 2023 produced the most statistically dominant performance in the history of Formula One and why the man who designed it chose the moment of its peak to begin planning his departure. This is the Red Bull RB19, the most dominant Formula One car ever built, and the last chapter of the most consequential engineering career the sport has seen. To understand the RB19, you need to understand the regulatory reset that preceded it. The 2022 technical regulations, the most comprehensive rewrite of Formula One's technical framework since 1983, had abolished the aerodynamic philosophy that had defined the sport since the return of ground effect in various forms through the 2010s and replaced it with a return to regulated underfloor tunnels. The Venturi-shaped floor tunnels that ran between the front and rear axles, generating downforce through the same ground effect principle that Colin Chapman's Lotus 78 had pioneered in 1977, were now the primary source of aerodynamic performance. The complex barge board arrays, the cascading front wing elements, the intricate floor edge geometries that had characterized the previous generation of cars, all were abolished or heavily restricted. Every team started from a new baseline. Every team's aerodynamic understanding of what the previous regulations had permitted was rendered irrelevant. The RB18 that Red Bull produced for the first season of the new regulations won 17 of 22 races. Its successor was not an evolution. It was the first car designed with a full season of data from the new aerodynamic concept, built by a team that had understood the new regulations faster than any rival and had been refining that understanding continuously since the first wind tunnel session of 2021. The RB19's floor tunnel geometry was, in the judgment of every aerodynamic engineer who examined the available data from the 2023 season, the primary source of its performance advantage. The 2022 regulations had defined the permitted tunnel geometry in terms of boundary conditions, the surfaces that the tunnels could not exceed, rather than in terms of the specific shapes within those boundaries. Within those boundaries, the design space was large. Red Bull's aerodynamic team, led by Pierre Wache as technical director with Newey providing the overarching design philosophy, had explored that space more thoroughly than any rival. The specific tunnel cross-section geometry they had converged on, which was never publicly disclosed and was, by all accounts within the paddock, a closely guarded internal asset, produced a downforce curve whose sensitivity to ride height variation was substantially lower than that of any rival car. In practical terms, this meant the RB19's floor was generating near-peak downforce across a wider range of operating conditions than Ferrari, Mercedes, or Aston Martin could achieve with their tunnel geometries. The car did not need to be held at a precise ride height to deliver its design performance. It worked across a range, and a car that works across a range is faster not in a single optimized condition, but in every condition a race presents. The suspension philosophy that enabled the floor's performance was the second axis of the RB19's advantage. The 2022 regulations had introduced a mandatory compliance test for front and rear suspension geometry, a measure designed to prevent the kind of ride height manipulation that had been a persistent regulatory controversy in previous eras. Within the constraints of those tests, the Red Bull suspension team had developed a geometry whose mechanical characteristics produced a ride height response to aerodynamic loading that other teams described in technical briefings through the season as inconsistent with what their own understanding of the regulations permitted. The FIA investigated the concern formally in the first half of the season. No violation was found. The car was legal. The suspension's behavior was the consequence of design choices within the permitted boundary, not outside it. The boundary had been defined by the regulations. Red Bull had found its inner edge. The Mercedes power unit, supplied to Red Bull under the Honda branding that reflected Honda's continued technical involvement despite their formal withdrawal from the sport at the end of 2021, produced, by independent analysis derived from speed trap data at full throttle circuits, a power output in qualifying specification of approximately 1,015 horsepower. The Ferrari power unit was estimated at approximately 1,020 horsepower. The Mercedes factory unit was approximately 1,010. The power differential between the leading power units in 2023 was, by the standards of previous eras, negligible. What the Red Bull power unit installation provided that its raw numbers did not capture was a cooling architecture whose compactness allowed the rear bodywork tightness that had been a characteristic of the Red Bull cars since the RB6 of 2010. The beam wing geometry, the rear wing end plate design, the diffuser exit conditions all benefited from a rear body package that rivals cooling requirements prevented them from replicating. The advantage was not the engine, it was the envelope the engine allowed. Verstappen won the first three races of the season, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Australia, from pole position by margins that established immediately that the competitive situation of 2023 would not resemble the contested championship of 2022, where Ferrari and Mercedes had both won races and the title had been decided with 3 rounds remaining. By Monaco in May, Verstappen had won 6 of the first 7 races. The exception was Singapore, where the street circuit's specific characteristics, low average speed, minimal straight-line sections, heavy reliance on mechanical grip and traction, produced conditions in which the RB19's aerodynamic advantages were less directly expressed, and Carlos Sainz's Ferrari took a victory that the paddock received as evidence that the Red Bull dominance had limits. It did not. Singapore was the anomaly. Every other circuit on the calendar was a Red Bull circuit in 2023 because the RB19's performance window was wide enough to encompass every other circuit's demands. Stay with this because the number that defines the 2023 season most completely is not the 19 victories or the pole positions. It is the average qualifying gap. Across the 22 races of the 2023 season, the gap between Verstappen's pole position time and the second fastest qualifier averaged 0.389 seconds. At circuits where the RB19's aerodynamic efficiency was most directly expressed, Spa, Silverstone, Monza, the gap exceeded 0.6 of a second. At no circuit did the gap fall below 1/10. There was no circuit on the calendar where the RB19 was not the fastest car in qualifying. There was no circuit where the opposition was within touching distance. The competitive landscape of 2023 was not a championship, it was a demonstration. The human dimension of the season centered on Verstappen himself, who drove with a consistency and an absence of error that the car's performance level made possible but did not make automatic. A driver in a dominant car can still make mistakes, Verstappen, across 19 victories and 3 second-place finishes, made none that mattered. His racecraft, specifically his ability to manage tire degradation across full race distances at a pace that prevented rivals from building the tire delta required to make alternative strategy calls competitive, was, in the analysis of the tire engineers who worked with every team, the individual performance variable that most clearly separated the 2023 season from even the dominant years of 2011, 2013, and 2016. The car gave him the tools. He used every one of them. Adrian Newey's announcement in the spring of 2024 that he would leave Red Bull Racing was, in its timing, the specific kind of irony that engineering history tends to produce. The man who had designed the RB6, the RB7, the RB8, the RB9, and the RB19 chose the moment of his final car's peak dominance to begin the process of departure. The reasons were internal: a cultural shift within the organization following the cost cap controversy of 2022 and the departure of several senior figures, and they were his to make. What they produced was the first confirmed endpoint of the longest sustained period of aerodynamic dominance in the sport's history. The RB19 was the last car Adrian Newey designed from its conceptual foundations to its racing specification. It won 19 races. Its win rate of 86.3% across the season was the highest ever recorded for a single car across a full championship season. The McLaren MP44 had won 15 of 16 races in 1988, a win rate of 93.7% achieved across a shorter season. The RB19 sustained its dominance across 22 rounds, a calendar nearly 40% longer than the one that had made the MP44's record possible. At the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in November 2023, the final race of the season, Verstappen qualified on pole and won. It was his 21st pole of the year and his 19th victory. In the Red Bull garage, the engineers who had spent 3 seasons building toward this expression of the ground effect concept celebrated a number that the sport had never produced before and may never produce again. In a hospitality suite somewhere in the Yas Marina paddock, Adrian Newey was already thinking about what came next. The car he had left was the best car he had ever built. That was always going to be the moment to leave. If this is the kind of engineering history that brought you here, subscribe. It keeps this channel producing the stories behind the numbers. Leave a comment. Is the RB19 the greatest Formula One car ever built, or does the MP4/4's win rate in a shorter season make a stronger argument? Next time, we go inside the car whose power unit the FIA investigated, settled privately, and never fully explained, and what that silence cost the 2019 championship.